So picture this. A polished obsidian loam hums the deep bass note of Chopin's left hand, while its cerulean accents trill like the right's fleeting grace. Observe how the central object swirls in ivory. The black, the blue, and the white bleed together in a hypnotic waltz, holding the gaze captive and seduced in silent rapture. A piece palatable for the night itself, reflected as a fragment of dreams and of nostalgia. What you have just heard was not the description for Van Gogh's Starry Night or any painting for that matter, but a rather exaggerated description for a fittingly frivolous object in a box of Oreos. And it's not like we're talking about the Oreos themselves, we're only referring to the appearance of their boxes. And somehow the other dress of a box of cookies seems to hold a certain degree of parallel to an iconic piece of art. How crazy is that? Still, the prospect of calling a box of Oreos in any close proximity to art just seems like a strange one. I mean, of course it's insane. Until you remember that in 1964, Andy Warhol actually stacked identical replicas of Brillo pad boxes in a gallery and called it art. Andy Warhol presented a similar artistic conundrum in many of his other pieces, from soup cans to cola bottles, and the world rightfully lost its mind. Because Warhol wasn't really asking whether these everyday objects that we see in the supermarket was beautiful or not. He was posing a trickier question of what even is art anymore. And as remarked by Arthur Danto in his essay After the End of Art, nothing need mark the difference outwardly between Andy Warhol's Brillo box and the Brillo boxes in the supermarket. And conceptual art demonstrated that there need not even be a palpable visual object for something to be a work of visual art. That meant that you could no longer teach the meaning of art by example. It meant that as far as appearances were concerned, anything could be considered a work of art. And it meant that if you were going to find out what art was, you had to turn from sense experiences to thought. You had, in brief, to turn to philosophy. Danto is inclined to posit that art's historical narrative has to conclude, but not its practice per se. The end marks a transition to an era of boundless possibilities, more or less, defined by context and meaning attributed by each interpreter of art, including both the artist and the audience. But here's what I think Danto has missed. The same thing can happen to the artist. Because think about it. If a mere soap pad cotton box can be considered something grandeur as art, then why can't the artists themselves? And I'm not just talking in terms of the relation to their body of works, no. Their self, their body, their brand, turning themselves into a product, a business, a machine before any algorithm could. The first person to really bring this commodification of the artist to my attention was, out of all people, my mother. Not just in an attempt to bash me away from pursuing any artistic endeavors per usual, nor out of any intrinsic motivation to, engage with a frivolous dialogue about pop culture, but rather, I guess it's how she just generally feels. Like when I ask her about, her favorite kind of music, it generally means no more than entertainment for her. Like her favorite artist being this Vietnamese bolero singers, for the primary reason of that he's popular, with a bit of charm, a bit of charisma, a bit of talent. He embodies the trope of an old-time, flamboyant showman that was and is still pretty appealing with a certain kind of demographic. He can sing any kind of song of his or of others' own catalog, and the tickets will probably still sell the same. This is just an example to infer how a lot of the times we care more for the persona than the art being presented. Now, I still love my mama. I'm just bringing this up to talk about the point that Danto makes about philosophy which shaped the art, where most of the times it seems to be inherent in the process of sense-making that us participants participates in. So the act of trying to understand what the artist is trying to say at times, and I would argue most frequently, are just assumptions drawing from our own experiences being projected onto the artist. So Rather than actively engaging with the content of the art itself, we become detached to a kayfabe, the spectacular element of the artist, till we consider it to be one of the art. This is why Warhol himself actually said that in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. He knew that the artist would become the art. But just like how Danto argues that art's historical narrative may come to an end, I will argue that the same can be said about the artist. Specifically, where their various character arcs and artistic development with their respective larger-than-life conclusions may either amplify the statue to be cemented into the cultural zeitgeist or completely be derailed into noise that enjoins sense-making out of nonsense. And I can't think of anyone who portrays both of these notions more perfectly than the one, the only, Kanye West.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
I'm standing up and I'm telling you, I am Warhol. I am the #1 most impactful artist of our generation.
A part of me just doesn't feel like it is a good idea to spend this much time discussing Kanye, as I feel like he's just addicted to the attention at this point. Like, it has to be about him all of the time. He even admitted to being jealous of Kendrick Lamar for being on that Cardi album. And his trolling antics is really just a reflection of that, you know? Some form of recapturing what he feels like belongs to him, if that makes sense. And that sentiment would probably be true to Kanye throughout every single one of his era, if you really think about it. From George Bush doesn't really care for black people up until this moment in time where he just sort of starts spewing Nazis adjacent rhetoric that is, I would say, trolling. Like, we can also see through it. And that really got me to think whether I was consuming Kanye himself as a performance, because we're seeing the artistic trajectory of Kanye's whole career coming to an end as we speak. And right now, it's looking quite tragic. He does not care as long as it offends whoever he thinks controls the status quo. And look, Kanye has achieved success with this strategy in the past. Part where his significance to culture comes from, and a lot of the times, he is right. Like, he makes good point. At least up until anything after Taylor Swift, he was right about that single ladies video. I know it, you know it. We just cannot afford to give him the benefit of the doubt for the fact that he will not apologize for any of the hatred that he has spread, without at least, you know, making a joke about Adam Sandler or Jonah Hill for being the supposed cause of his redemption. Since once this attitude has been reinforced with positive reward over and over, like he doesn't actually lose anything by being cancelled, actually gives him a high, it becomes really hard to escape and can be easily exploited by certain grifters who does not have or the artist's best interest in mind. And let's be clear, right? Kanye himself does not care, as long as he can get away with it. Knowing this, I think we can say that we have the sufficient context to interpret Kanye's actions and deem it as boring and tiresome. Nevertheless, Kanye's crash outs essentially serve to show that his music, once groundbreaking, now feels secondary, where we have to face the fact that there's just not as much care being put into production anymore, and the artist himself took on the role of attracting attention and interpretations at the same time. In other words, the artist now embodies the art. And like Danto points out how art has ended by the eradication of ideological form, the artist may too. This is not simply about Kanye, however. It's about what happens when the artist's whole story ends, but the performance can't stop. It's about the artist as a collapsing spectacle, a living exhibit in the museum of late capitalism. The artist, after the end of art, need not to culminate in a self-destructive spectacle when they come to embody the art. Like Kanye's trajectory has clearly shown us what happens when one conflates the person with the product. I would say that a lot of the other artists, great artists out there, have been able to demonstrate how their artistries can live in, just inherent within the body of works that they clearly put so much thought into. As long as there is a healthy degree of separation by the virtue of the art itself not being contained in or overshadowed by the artist's presence. Kendrick Lamar's recent view with Drake proved that even in hip-hop's most fierce of all worst exchanges, the artist can still weaponize the spectacle for the art rather than against it. In contrast to how Kanye's provocations may have blurred into noise, Kendrick's tracks turn rap feud into a call for action, a cultural reckoning of a kind, without letting the drama to overshadow the craft. The act of performing Not Like Us at the Super Bowl did not only win the beef, it cemented his legacy beyond pop culture. As Danto might agree, art's end was never really about cessation, but liberation. So the artist's end need to be a collapse into commodification either. It can be a final brushstroke, a last chord, a closing scene, one which is offered, authentic, and apt.